Hi, welcome everyone.
Hi, Jordan.
Great to see all your smiling faces.
Hello.
This is strange, but it's the new way. So I'm just going to begin in our regular way in terms of welcoming you all to our April meeting. The Greater Victoria School District wishes to recognize and acknowledge the Esquimalt and Songhees nations on whose traditional territories we live, we learn, and we do our work. Since this is a remote meeting for everyone, perhaps you're on different territories, and I invite you to take time to reflect on your relationship and connection to the land. Even though we're not all together, these are important things and reflections. So please do consider that as we move through our meeting today. So in terms of housekeeping, I'm going to ask everybody to keep themselves muted so that we don't get echo. That seems to be the main challenge. While the other side of that is when we're muting each other, we have to remember muting ourselves. We're going to have to remember to unmute before we speak. But this is just the way it's going to be, and we're going to go slow and steady and figure it out together. And I've got it so that I can see as many people as possible on one screen, and I encourage you to do the same as well. You can select up at the top right how you want to view. And certainly for trustees and partners, and we want to make sure everybody has a chance to be heard. So if I miss you, just please patiently indicate, and I'm going to be watching and scanning as much as possible. And if we need to move back because we went too fast, then that's just what we'll do, because we're all learning. So I thank you in advance for your patience. So our first item on the agenda today is an approval of the agenda. So I'll invite anybody who has, thank you, Trustee Painter, Trustee Whitaker, Secretary, Treasurer Morris.
Chair, may I add 45 seconds of a report at Trustee Reports at C2?
And this is reminding me, I know what Secretary Treasurer Morris is adding. She's going to remind me, which I have all set up right here, to let everybody know that the question period will be by email, and so that the questions can be emailed to boardmeeting0427@sd61.bc.ca. So that's board meeting followed by 0427, right, for April 27th, sd61.bc.ca. And then when we get to questions at E, our communications lead, Lisa McPhail, will report the questions out, and we'll do our very best to answer them. And of course, if we can't answer them straight away, then we'll follow up as per our regular process. So just one more time, the email is boardmeeting0427@sd61.bc.ca. So if you have questions for us, please send them in. Trustee Painter?
Yes, thank you. I have two additions to the agenda. One is the BC STA Provincial Councillor report under C, Trustee Reports. So that can be under C3 perhaps, because Trustee McNally has put forward her verbal. And then as well, I have an addition under new business, which is a motion. And the motion, would you like me to read the motion out, Chair? Yeah, the motion is that the board direct staff to analyze options to direct capital funding for making the Vic High seismic project a net zero ready project. And this amendment was provided to trustees beforehand, but my apologies, I have not yet provided it to staff for recording, so I'm going to send that over to them now. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so that'll be under new business at G1. Are there any other additions to our agenda? Seeing none, then I'll ask for a trustee to move the amended agenda. Trustee Painter, Trustee Leonard. All those in favor of approving the agenda as amended? Any against? Any abstentions? Pretty sure that was unanimous. Excellent. Okay, so now we're on to our minutes from our March 9th, 2020. Seems like a lifetime ago. Are there any additions, questions, amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, would somebody move approval of the March 9th minutes? Thank you, Trustee Whitaker, Trustee Leonard. All those in favor? Okay, that's unanimous. Any business arising from the minutes? Trustee Duncan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, on page 4 of the minutes, so it's page 9 of the board pack up at E1B. There were some trustee questions with respect to low interest loans, water testing, and QP labor force providing childcare. I'm not sure what has and hasn't been responded to, with the exception of my question around water testing. And I just wondered if I could get an update.
Certainly, I'll pass that to Secretary Treasurer Morris.
Thank you, and I'll pass that to Chuck Morris.
Good evening. I've asked our maintenance manager and his assistant to go through it and make sure that everything is up to date. And the goal was to get it on the web this week.
That's great news. Thanks so much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chuck. Is there any other business arising? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to correspondence. So there's a letter that the board sent to Saanich Parks and Rec with regards to the STAR committee and their plans. Any questions or comments on that? Seeing none, I'll move to my report, which is, I'll keep it short tonight, but I did want to let everybody know, especially folks who may be following from home, what the plan is for the board and for our meetings as we move forward. So hopefully this is successful tonight. We're obviously would like to hear feedback if you have ideas of what we can do better or different. If this with this format, obviously we're limited and doing the best we can. So for May, we're not having any of our standing committee meetings as our staff are still really focused on the COVID response and planning as we move forward. We will be having our regular board meeting at the end of May, just like this. And there may be some budget pieces, which we'll discuss later in our agenda tonight. And then our plan is, and what we're really working towards, is that for June, we can be back to our regular standing committee meetings and trying to create some of that normalcy of our regular rhythms as a board. There's a lot of business to be done and important discussions to be had. And so we're hoping to be sort of moving out of that crisis mode and into a more regular rhythm. And so that is the plan to the end of the school year. Of course, things continue to change near hourly, it feels sometimes. So that is simply what we are working towards, and hopeful that that's what we'll be able to accomplish. And again, if folks have feedback or ideas or concerns, please forward them to board, and we'll be glad to have that feedback and do our very best to make this as engaging and meaningful as possible. So that's my update. So I'll pass it over to Trustee McNally.
Thank you. A quick update. I was unable to attend the April 20th Indigenous Nations Education Committee meeting, but I did get an update from an attendee. And if I've left out anything critical, our superintendent was attending and we'll be able to fill in the blanks. A discussion was held, I'm going to read this. A discussion was held and feedback provided to the committee in regards to feedback and consultation that was held with all Indigenous education partners as it relates to the current proposed goal of Indigenous Ed Goal 2 of the strategic plan. Indigenous community partners examined and reviewed that goal to provide specific strategies that they felt were culturally relevant to support the overall goal of Indigenous students. Also discussed was the budget of the department, overall staffing and composition, and how Indigenous Ed is moving toward a new model of service delivery to support Indigenous students and families across the district. And lastly, INEC discussed the purpose, rationale, and development of a terms of reference for what INEC is. This has been going on for a number of years, actually, their role and how it functions to support Indigenous students of the district. So that's my report, and the superintendent can fill in if there's anything critical that I missed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Trustee McNally. Are there any questions about the report? Trustee Duncan?
Thank you, Chair. Just a request from me to Trustee McNally. Would you mind emailing out an electronic copy of what you just read out?
Absolutely. I'll send that to all trustees.
Thank you. I'll now pass it over to Trustee Painter.
Thank you, Chair. As the BCSTA Provincial Council rep, I have provided a brief summary of our April 17th. Wow, the time has gone by strangely. Of our April 17th BCSTA Zoom conference call. It was a short meeting. We talked about the BCSTA budget. I have provided a summary analysis for trustees in my report, but you may access more broad detail about the budget, including a budget breakdown in the BCSTA Hub for anyone who is interested in seeing that information. And I'm happy to take anyone's questions.
Are there any questions with regards to BCSTA report? Trustee McNally.
Thank you. I'm just going to be tiresome and say that I have asked a couple of people, including my colleague, Trustee Painter, where it could find a more traditional budget statement from the BCSTA. They've given a really interesting breakdown of changes in the budget and dollar amounts up and down, but there is nowhere like the budget that I'm used to seeing from our district. And if anybody knows where one is, I'd love to find it.
Trustee McNally, I encourage you to write to the BCSTA. I'm sure they've got those documents.
Thank you, Chair. I have done that multiple times, but I'll do it again.
Now we're going to move to the superintendent's report at D1. Superintendent Green.
Thank you, Chair. You can look onto page 14 to give a summary of my report. I would just like to speak to the amazing work that the staff and our partner groups have done in this COVID reality. It's hard to believe that in a short period of time, our entire district and all the focus that we were once doing flipped over almost overnight. And so we were able to create our pandemic team, bring them together over spring break, and truly start thinking about what the reality could look like as we anticipated returning to school. We spent a lot of time talking about what the ministry's focal points were, which was, of course, our ability to get devices and materials into students' hands, be able to get our teachers in and out of buildings safely to get their materials in order to provide an education continuous learning plan going. And then to look at food distribution for our families and our vulnerable learners and our essential service workers that we knew we had to get in there, which was an awful lot to do. It seems like a year has gone by, but the amount of work that took and the amount of energy from all collected was absolutely amazing. The response was unbelievable. People worked incredibly hard. And then every so often a thing would come up and our public would say, something like playgrounds needed to be cut off and then to be enveloped with safety tape. And our team simply responded. And so that happened over a period of a month and a half. We responded on a daily basis, on a long-term basis, on a planning basis, huge amount of work and energy. I'd also like to commend our partner groups who have spent a lot of time, their time with me, talking on Zoom, talking about what we need to be doing moving forward, what the plan is. Their input has been invaluable. We all know this has been a very scary time for all of our staff and students and community. It's been an awful lot to navigate, and I cannot commend the team effort that's been put forward to the extent it is between staff, partner groups, community. It's been absolutely unreal. So, and my last piece, of course, is to reach out to the trustees, and I know that they've been reaching out to schools and commending them for the incredible work they did. They also are meeting with, you're also meeting with me on a regular basis. I think Greater Victoria can be very proud of the team of effort that they've put forward to be able to get to where we are in this very weird, surreal scenario called a pandemic. We still have a long way to go. There'll be lots of changes, and we know we're in this for the long haul, but we couldn't have done it without the team. And so I totally commend all of our players. It's been an amazing journey.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Green. It really is amazing what everyone has pulled together. I feel very proud of all of the work happening across the district. Trustee McNally, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I'm wondering if there was anything that would be of specific interest to trustees coming out of the principals and vice principals meeting.
My first question in my head is which one? We've had numerous meetings. And the regular ones that we've usually have, and then some, just like our partner groups, ones that pop up because something imminent happens. So most of our lead has been through health, and the deputy minister follows up from health. And then we meet with our principals and vice principals, and that can be everything from how do we look at how we're going to get students in and out of schools, how are we going to deliver our food? So much of the same components that you've just heard me speak to, and I know that we brought up to speed. And then there's the regular running. It just seems like lives are very full, plates are very full, but things need to happen. So staffing packages, how to be talking about the budget. And so some of those components that need to happen no matter what, and get ready for staffing as a regular basis. But truly, I would say, at this point, about 80% of our time has been spent on the next steps to how to handle the COVID virus.
Are there any other questions for the superintendent? Seeing none, could we have, would a trustee move approval or that we receive the superintendent's report? Trustee Painter and Trustee Whitaker, thank you so much. All those in favor of receiving the superintendent's report as presented? That's unanimous. Thank you so much. Now we move on to the 2020-2021 calendar, which feels very optimistic at this point. Superintendent?
I'll pass it over to Associate Greg Kitchen.
Yeah, the calendar you see before you was the one that the board passed in motion or in draft form. We posted it for 30 days, and now we've actually exceeded those 30 days. We got some feedback from the community. The feedback we got were generally in areas that the partner groups had already considered in developing the calendar. So nothing that would have forced our committee to rethink the draft calendar. And so we're confident that this is the calendar that works best, and we want to bring that forward for final approval from the board.
Thank you, Associate Kitchen. Are there any comments or questions around the calendar, especially any of our partners who have any feedback they want to provide? Okay, I'm not seeing anybody indicate would a trustee like to move that we approve the calendar as presented. Thank you, Trustee Leonard. Trustee Whitaker? There's no discussion on the motion. I'll call the question. All those in favor? And that looks unanimous. Any abstentions? No, we're all there. 9 of us. Good. So now we're moving on to the Secretary Treasurer's report. So I'll pass it to Secretary Treasurer Morris.
Do we have, sorry, D1C on the previous page under the calendar?
Oh, sorry, everyone. It is hiding at the very bottom of our agenda. We do have time for trustee questions under the superintendent's report. Trustee McNally.
Thanks, Chair. I emailed earlier to ask if we could have the agendas posted where they usually are. And I'm just wondering if yes or no, where minutes and presentations will be when they've been in the past posted on the meetings page.
Kim,
Superintendent?
Kim, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So as the board knows, but perhaps the public doesn't, we've been moving toward a piece of software called eScribe. And that's a board meeting application that tracks agendas, minutes, attachments, things like that, and voting. And so the reason we moved the agenda posting, and thank you, Trustee McNally, for bringing it to our attention that we made no note of it in the regular page. We have fixed that now, is that eScribe will post directly to a calendar. And so on the page where agendas usually appear, we've now put a message saying there's a new way to access agendas, please click here. And what it will take you to is a different page with a calendar on it. And when you click on the, for example, April's calendar would say April 27th, regular board meeting. You click on that sort of appointment in that calendar and up pops the agenda, and the minutes will eventually be there, and any kind of presentation that's provided, similar to what you see on the regular page now. So my apologies, we didn't point people in the right direction on that, and I thank you for bringing that to our attention, but there is a redirection there now.
Right, I did see that. Thank you so much, Secretary Treasurer.
Are there any other trustee questions? Okay, seeing none, then we will, for real this time, move to the Secretary Treasurer's report. Secretary Treasurer Morris?
Yes, I offer the activities in March for you to have a look at, obviously truncated fairly quickly during COVID, and just invite any questions if you have any.
Any questions?
Sorry, I will add verbally that we have placed, we have registered 105 students for childcare or for essential service worker care in the district. And so that's been a lot of great work providing service to students. A big shout out to principals and vice principals who are hosting that care in their schools. They've been working very hard scheduling both education assistants, teachers, and children and families. And a huge thank you to education assistants and anybody else who's attending to helping those children with their schoolwork and generally caring for them during the day while their parents are at work. So a big thank you to anybody that's contributing to that care.
Thank you. So I'm looking for any questions or comments on this Secretary Treasurer's report. Otherwise, we'll move to receive it.
Question?
Trustee McNally?
Thank you. On page 21, this was a really interesting and new format for me to read. So when I got to page 21, I saw that every other date refers for completion of projects refers to March 31st, 2021. And on page 21, I did email the Secretary Treasurer thinking this is just a typo in sub 2 at the very bottom of the page. It says March 31st, 2020. I don't think we can complete anything by then.
Are you talking about the monthly report?
I'm not exactly sure where we are in terms of the paperwork, so I'm just looking at page 21. Maybe this isn't the appropriate time to raise that.
That's the capital bylaw. So that'll be our next item on the agenda. So right now we're looking to receive Secretary Treasurer Morris's report, which is on page 16 of 32.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Nothing.
Thank you, Trustee Leonard, Trustee Whitaker. All those in favor? Okay, and that's unanimous. So now we'll move to the capital bylaw, which starts at page 17.
Sorry, Chair. I was slow with my unmuting. Do you mind if I just ask a quick question of the Secretary Treasurer?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. I just had a question about where we're at with the turf replacement under warranty at Oak Bay, and if you give us an update on how that's going.
Secretary Treasurer?
And I'll pass that over to Chuck as well.
Our staff have been speaking with the folks at AstroTurf. They are arranging to come out hopefully sometime next week to have a look at it and make some decisions. They need a number of days of dry weather, no rain, because that affects the substrate when they're laying it down. So they, as well as us and all of our friends and neighbors, are looking forward to getting that thing replaced as quickly as possible. So AstroTurf should be over here sometime next week.
Thanks so much.
Okay, are there any other questions before we move on to the capital bylaw? Trustee Painter.
Sorry, apparently I have to unmute in a different manner now. Just on the topic of fields at Oak Bay, I was wondering if there's been any movement on the settlement regarding the other field, the improperly laid natural field.
Secretary Treasurer?
Chuck may want to fill in here, but I believe we've been back and forth on that. That's the rugby field you're speaking about? Yeah, okay. So I think there's been some back and forth with the installer or the installer, and I do believe that has been settled. Chuck, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. It has been settled. Everybody agreed to a much smaller amount. So we're done. The lawyers finished with it and we're free to move on. The field's been rebuilt by our people. It's good to go anytime once kids get back on it. And we did it for a fraction of the cost of what it could have cost.
Thank you so much. Trustee Painter.
Which one?
Sorry, just to clarify with Chuck, does that mean that there were no expenses out of pocket for the district, that the reduced fee was sufficient to cover the district's expenses in getting the field remediated?
Yes, there was an amount left owing. And so we negotiated through the lawyer to take that number quite a ways down. So we're able to save a fair piece of money on that. So it's to everybody's satisfaction.
Thank you. Trustee Painter?
Thank you. Since we're on the topic of fields, just really quick, I'm wondering if you can have an update or just a reminder about the time frame for finishing up or cleaning up the Northridge Field project. Haven't had a chance to visit it recently, but I did visit it at the tail end of last year. So I'm just curious where we're at with that one.
Through the chair. The field has been remediated, and every time I go by there, it looks pretty good. We've got our fellows checking on it every once in a while. It's almost as green and lush looking as the one at Oak Bay.
It's beautiful. I was there recently.
Good.
Okay, any other questions before we move on to the capital bylaw? Okay, Secretary Treasurer.
Okay, thank you. Last June, 2019, the board approved its 5-year annual capital plan submission to the ministry. And in the month of March, we received our funding announcement letter for the 2021 capital planning year. And that's the ministry's year from April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. The district was successful in receiving funding for some fairly major projects. One HVAC control system at Tillicum, a building enclosure upgrade, window upgrade at Mount Douglas Secondary, the mechanical upgrade and HVAC upgrade built into the Vic High capital project, as well as a universally accessible playground at Doncaster. We were not successful in a major capital announcement such as Shoreline or Cedar Hill. But we remain hopeful on those, and we were not successful in acquiring any buses.
Okay, any questions? Trustee Duncan?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Morris. I appreciate the report and the updates on where we're at. I'm wondering if the ministry was able to provide, in addition to the letter, any other feedback about the failed application. So in relation to Shoreline Middle and Cedar Hill Middle seismic, what it's going to take to get us there and get those projects moving.
Sure, I think that the ministry is committed to approving capital projects as it can. So while this is a point in time, we know that we've received announcements outside of the regular capital planning funding agreement window. I would say if we asked the ministry, they would put us up against Surrey and growing districts like that in terms of capital projects and the priority that we fall into necessarily along with 60 other school districts. So I haven't asked the question directly, but I feel like I know what the answer might be. And so we continue to put our major capital project priorities forward and wait for those announcements to come in. And if we'll put them back on our 21-22 5-year annual capital plan that the board will hopefully approve in June.
Trustee Duncan?
Thank you, Chair. I just had another question in relation to the buses. What were we asking in relation to buses?
Chuck, I'll ask you to answer that if that's okay.
Thank you. We were asking for 2 more 72 passenger buses and 1 short bus. In conversation after they were not awarded, he wanted more information from us, as well as they had a lot of competing interests. We don't move a lot of kids. There's a lot of districts out there that have buses that needed to be retired, and so they have to share that value around. So that was acceptable to me at this time.
Thanks so much to both of you.
Trustee McNally?
Thanks. This is probably minor, and it's probably me not understanding something completely, but now again at the bottom of page 21, completion by March 31st, 2020. Maybe I didn't read this thoroughly enough. Is that correct? Through the chair to the Secretary Treasurer.
Secretary Treasurer?
I do have an email into the ministry. I believe that is a typo, Trustee McNally, so I can update you after that, but we definitely can't complete these projects by a month ago.
I didn't think so. Thanks so much.
Are there any other questions? Do any of our partners have questions? Okay, then I think we're looking for a motion. Trustee Painter, Trustee Leonard. So the motion is that the board agree to give all 3 readings to capital bylaw number 2020-2021 CPSD 61 01 Capital Plan 2020/21 at the meeting of April 27th, 2020, and the motion is to be carried unanimously. Yeah, that is the motion on the floor. If there's any discussion, I'm not seeing anybody indicate, so I'll move to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Oh, that's all of us. Okay. So the motion carries. And then the second motion.
May I ask a favor? When you indicate that Painter has moved or seconded, would you mind providing the first name? I can't really see in the group here.
Yes, I definitely can. That was Trustee Ryan Painter. Okay, so we've got a second recommended motion. Would anybody like to move it? Thank you, Trustee Whitaker, Trustee Leonard. So the motion is that capital bylaw number 2020-2021 CPSD 6101 capital plan 2020-2021 be read a first time April 27th, read a first time the 27th day of April 2020, read a second time the 27th day of April 2020, read a third time, passed and adopted the 27th day of April 2020, and that the Secretary Treasurer and the Board Chair be authorized to execute and seal this bylaw on behalf of the Board. All those in favor? And that is unanimous. Excellent. So now we're on to the budget update, Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you. So I think Andy is going to put up the presentation. And I'm going to ask him to move the slides when it's time. So the package tonight will be posted to the website tomorrow. By no means are we asking for the board to approve a budget tonight. What we'll be doing is moving toward May in terms of asking for approval. And so we have some work to do between now and then and some consultation to do as well. So welcome to Budget 2020-2021. And I'll ask Andy to move the slide. So first we want to talk about the context that we started off budget in. We talked about being back in February and having a great budget plan. We got our funding announcement on March 12th, and I think approximately 6 or 18 hours later, COVID came about. And so our context now has definitely shifted our planning and our decision making. And so what we really want to focus on tonight is the operating grant, where we see the biggest impact as a result of COVID, and sort of talk about how we've shifted our thinking and where to from here. What we're trying to lay out is a discussion about an approach to balancing this budget, and see if the board thinks we're on the right track, and if so, we'll carry on with the rest of the work during May. Regardless of our context, guiding principles are very important in any big decision making, and budget should be no different, no matter if we're in pre-COVID, mid-COVID, or post-COVID. And so when we're looking at our annual budget, we should always be putting student learning at the forefront. We should be making sure resources are aligned with the strategic plan, making sure that input and consultation are meaningful, and that decisions are sustainable. And you'll hear me talk a lot about sustainable tonight. So the process to date, again, I take us back to February, where we were rolling along with some public consultation, student symposium, thought exchange, talking tables, March 12th funding announcement, COVID, and now here we are today after a lot of pivoting and shifting. We're here with the superintendent's balanced recommendation tonight. By no means, again, are we asking for the board to approve. We have not presented a budget to the board yet, or to stakeholders, or to the public. So here we are tonight. Between April 27th and May 25th, we'll be looking for budget feedback with the board, hopefully approving its 2021 budget on May 25th. So pre-COVID, again, some great stakeholder and public engagement. Really happy with how that went. We were drafting our strategic plan and had hoped to be moving forward to finalization by this time so we could better align our budget with that strategic plan. We were starting to talk as a staff, as a leadership team, about living within our means and trying to reduce or eliminate that structural deficit that we find ourselves in. And I'll talk a lot about that structural deficit tonight. We started to talk a little bit about equity analysis and supply allocations. So why do some schools receive more or less than others when it comes to teachers, principal, admin time, clerical hours, education assistants? And do we, or have we carefully and transparently explained how those staffing levels come to a school and where they come from? And then in terms of other supports like reading recovery, strings, low incident staffing, and meals supports, we really wanted to take a look at the equity in the district and start to talk about some of those unique factors that make a school more of a profile than a formula. And we talked a little bit about that at Talking Tables. We wanted to talk about refresh cycles in terms of furniture and equipment, where a school may or may not be able to afford to replace a class set of furniture each year. And we wanted to take a look at the total cost of technology in the district, and given the number of students we have and the age of equipment we have, was there a refresh cycle that we should be putting into place? And so those are some of the things we wanted to talk about. We also wanted to talk about professional development and capacity building. When we talk about being in our schools and the people working with our students, are we making adequate investment in their development and their skill level in terms of providing the best service they can for the best outcomes for our students as they can. So those are some of the things that were percolating pre-COVID. Now during COVID, we sort of had to, obviously, we took a step back. We took a shift from change to stability. And, you know, this was really the superintendent's guidance in terms of now may not be the time to be rocking the boat and making several changes. So what we're presenting tonight in the operating grant again, and capital and special purpose will come later, is really a status quo budget, obviously with plus or minuses and the changes that we don't have any control over. We think that this approach is the least disruptive to the system at this point when there is so much disruption already. And we think this approach will provide us time to understand learning in COVID for 2021 if it indeed does continue into the next year or for the whole of the next year. And so really what we're presenting tonight is a status quo budget with some changes to it. And we want to make sure that the board is on board with that. And if not, we'll take a different approach with the remainder of our work till May 25th. So I do want to talk about a structural deficit in the operating fund. And what is a structural deficit? A structural deficit will start to determine adjustments to spending based on updated revenue. And so there are two outcomes. When the revenue is greater than expenses, so we have more money than we need to spend, we're going to have a surplus. And that means we can have a conversation about where to focus our dollars and what plans we can make and what initiatives we can take on to improve learning opportunities for students. When revenue is less than expense, we find ourselves in a deficit and looking at what we can cut from the budget. And so when we can live within our means where revenues equal expenses, when we do have extra money, we can talk about spending rather than cutting. And so School District 61 has generally balanced its budget with depending on the year-end surplus, and has not necessarily lived within its means where revenues do equal expenses. We definitely do use a lot of surplus to balance our future year's budgets, and that's something we wanted to move away from. And we'll continue to try to do that work in 21-22. But as I said, this is a status quo budget. And so we're definitely in a place where we have a structural deficit in School District 61 for 2021. So how do we start to formulate the budget? The first step is enrollment. We put in our 3-year enrollment. We submitted our enrollment in mid-February to the ministry, and that was for 2021 through to 22-23. The 2020-2021 increase was 23 students. And when we look at 3 years from 2019-20 to 22-23, we're going to have an increase of approximately 300 students. And this graph will show where the increases are for all the types of enrollment that we have. Obviously, the biggest one being regular. And if we just go to the next chart, this gives you a little bit better idea when we remove the regular enrollment, because it's such a big number, you can start to see where the growth and the shrinkage is in our types of enrollment in the district. So we can see Indigenous enrollment growing, ELL is shrinking a little. Inclusion level 3, 2, and 1 are all shrinking a little, and there's a good explanation for this. It's not a trend that we normally see. We know that in 1920 we pushed out a lot of staffing in the spring and fell short of the enrollment in the fall. So this year we've taken a much more conservative approach to the numbers of level 1, 2, 3 inclusion students. So where you see a lowering or a lower number than 1920, that number will probably grow over time and into the fall. But for now, because we had to add so much staffing in the fall last year for inclusion, we're trying to be more conservative this year. And again, distributed learning, alternate, all shrinking a little. So our biggest growth is definitely around the Indigenous population, which is great to see. Step 2 of the operating budget is to apply that enrollment to the funding formula. We're overall projecting an increase in the operating grant of approximately $2.6 million. And if we go to the next slide, we can see here the types of line items that are in our operating grant. And the increase to the base is 1.98%. And this is largely made up of a per pupil amount increase of $92 per student, which represents about 1.23% increase. And all of the types of enrollment and operating grant line items, the base in February, the base in May, Indigenous, inclusion, equity of opportunity, things like that. Anything above the line is an increase in funding, and anything below the line is a decrease in funding. And so I want to bring your attention to the equity of opportunity grant. Oh, sorry, can you go back, Andy? Sorry. Yeah, so about the middle of the chart there, you can see a 1.15 million on the top, and the bar is named equity of opportunity. I just want to point out that this is a new line item in the budget, and I'll talk a little bit about it further. So this is a new line item in the operating grant, and you'll note that the education plan dollars to the right of that decreased by 0.21 million. In order to fund this new line item in the operating grant, the ministry provincially used about 60% of the education plan money to put into the equity of opportunity grant. And I'll explain what that is further along. Inclusion, below the line, again, you can see we are conservative in our enrollment projections, and the February base for our enrollment count for DL, continue to add things like that off to the left. That's below by about 0.32 million. We had about 300,000 more in funding for February 2020 than we are projecting for next year. That may pan out to be different. That depends how life in COVID goes in terms of distributed learning. Sorry, Andy, next to the next one. This chart will put the operating grant increases up against the enrollment increases. And the story I want to tell here is I want you to take a careful look at 2021 for both graphs. So it's important to note that they both go up, and that's great. When we see increased enrollment, we want to see increased operating grant, and that's great. But really the 2021 bump there that looks so much different than the enrollment growth is that 1.1 million equity of opportunity grant. And so we don't want you to think that the per pupil amount grew by that much in 2021 or anything like that. So we need to understand that this is a new fund in the operating grant, and to understand that spike. Next slide. Step 3 is to take a look at other revenue in the operating grant. And so we know we get the majority of our operating revenue from the Ministry of Education, but we know that we have other revenue as well. And this is more detailed in the backup documents. But the major changes to the other revenue that we normally receive, either from the ministry or anybody else. Sorry. Is we usually receive an amount of about $110,000 for carbon tax reimbursement. Can everybody still hear me okay? My computer is giving me a message. Okay. Okay. So usually we receive a line item for carbon tax reimbursement, as well as the employer health tax of 1.63 million. Those two items have been rolled up into the operating grant block. And so when we see an increase in the operating grant per pupil or into the block, we say sometimes the ministry has these recurring supplements that they provide, and then eventually after a few years, they roll them up into the block. The big information here is the International Student Program. And so we're projecting a loss of 483 students for the 2021 year. And that equates to about $6.3 million in lost revenue. And that's not unexpected. Most districts in the province are going through this right now. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. And our miscellaneous obviously is just a small amount once we roll up those miscellaneous amounts. Step 4 is we start to look at different scenarios or models in the operating grant. And so the first thing I like to do is take a look at a structural deficit. And the assumptions for the structural deficit are, if we did nothing else but update our revenues and had the same level of service and expenses for the year, what would that structural deficit be? And do we make the necessary cuts within the expenditure side of the budget to make that balance to zero, or do we depend on surplus dollars to balance our future budget? So are we using the credit card to pay the bills? And so I look at that, and I look at the pattern in the district, and I wonder if that is sustainable. And when I look at a miscellaneous revenue amount of $6.3 million going missing from the district, and I really wonder how sustainable our model is by using a structural deficit or a future surplus to balance. And I wonder if we shift from year-end surpluses covering status quo, if we start to really take a look at the core business that we do and the supports that we offer and the efficiencies that we can find to live within our expenses. So in this model, we've adjusted the revenues for the operating grant and the miscellaneous revenue. We've taken out any surplus that's in the 1920 budget because we know that's not in the 2021 budget, it's one time. And then we leave all the expenses status quo. We don't adjust for enrollment. We don't adjust for any collective agreement increases. We don't adjust for any international decline. And we remove the surplus from the expense side too. And so our structural deficit right now is $6.3 million. We can move on. So the next model is the model we bring for you tonight, which is a balanced budget. We're calling this the superintendent's recommendations, but really this is a staff budget. So the assumptions here are that we've adjusted all the revenues. We've included the surplus to balance the budget. And that surplus is $12 million. And so it's important to know that 3.3 million of that will be reimbursed by the ministry, assuming that the collective agreements will be ratified by the end of June, and that increases go out to GVTA members as planned. And that is an assumption in the budget because we know those collective agreements aren't ratified yet. And so that's about $3.3 million. The ministry has said in your budget process, plan on using surplus, and then when the agreements are ratified, they'll recalc the operating budget right away. And then we flip, we increase our revenue and increase our surplus as well. Another piece of the 12.1 is 2.79 million that the board appropriated in its 18-19 year end for the 2021 year. And so this is a decision the board makes every fall after it receives the audited financial statements and knows what its surplus is. And in this case, at the end of June 2019, the board made a decision to move 2.7 million into the 2021 budget, which leaves us with about $6.1 million that we are going to count on as surplus from the end of this year. And so we would call that 1920 surplus that we'll be inserting into the revenue portion of our balanced budget. So if we were to do all those things and we adjust our expense side for enrollment growth, our contractual obligations being collective agreement increases and other increases, the international student program decline, and taking into account the equity of opportunity grant that we have to attend to that has a specific purpose. If we are able to do all of these things, and these are in the supporting documents, we will have a balanced budget of 0. So how reasonable is, oh, sorry. So this is just a chart of the two models. So we have model 1, which is the structural deficit, and we have model 2, which is balanced, and the different kinds of assumptions that were made in each of these models. If this had been a year where we were working toward being more sustainable and living within our means, you would start to see models 3, 4, and 5 blown out on the right-hand side, where we would start to make changes to the expense side, where we would start to make alignment to our strategic plan goals in order to improve opportunities for students. You would see our reliance on surplus going down. And we would be able to put our planning up front in the spring in terms of what kind of initiatives we wanted to put in place and make sure that we were able to advance the strategic plan and learning for students rather than waiting for the fall to see what we had in surplus. Next slide. Yep. Staffing. Staffing is largely status quo. What we do see, obviously, when we see $6.3 million or $6.7 million leaving our revenue, we have to look to the expense side as well. And so this budget contemplates a loss of 33.571 teachers in the international program resulting from COVID and that inability to travel and the general safety of just being at home. The other change to the expense side in staffing is the collective agreement increases for QP and GVTA, as well as some equivalent increases proposed for excluded staff and principals and vice principals. There are some, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, there are some minor adjustments to the Indigenous staffing model, and we heard Trustee McNally mention a new model of service delivery. And so there are some changes in classifications, although in general, the staffing components are robust because that funding is targeted and we can't use it for anything else. Services and supplies are largely status quo. We haven't impacted any department budgets. We have not impacted any school allocations. So the money on the ground in the schools has not changed. We didn't look at cutting any of the services or supplies available to resource classrooms or buy supplies or furniture or anything like that. What we do have to attend to here is there is new money in the budget, that equity of opportunity grant, and the the three categories that the ministry wants us to cover off with that funding is for children and youth in care, for children and youth receiving non-clinical mental health supports, and students in the bottom half of the Canadian after-tax income distribution. And so I think the ministry's heard loud and clear and looked at some of the results in the province around student success and has given us a mandate here with this money. It's not targeted in a special purpose fund, but it is got a purpose within the operating grant. So what we need to do with this money, right now it's just sitting in a supply account. We need to decide on a spending plan, and staff will bring a recommendation about that. We need to decide if any existing human resources or initiatives are attending to this already, and if so, should we carry on with them? And what new initiatives or new staffing should we be putting into schools to directly impact these three categories for students in schools? It's important to note here, I think you're all familiar with the LINK budget, which provides our youth and family counselors as well as all of our meals money, or most of our meals money. LINK remains in status quo. We're still receiving the LINK budget, so it's not like we have to pivot to paying for meals or anything else out of this money. So that's good news for the district and for the province. So when we talk about using $12 million in terms of surplus and reserves for future years, I wanted to take a look back historically and see if that was reasonable within what we had done before in terms of balancing our future budgets. And so you can see the history starts at 2013-14, and these numbers are taken from the financial statements in the notes. And this is your appropriated surplus history. And so, you know, we can run down the right-hand side and take a look at, you know, 14 million, 17 million, 18 million, and we get down to our 13 million, and it doesn't look out of range, especially since we will have that 3.3 returned by the ministry once the collective agreements are ratified. And so when we say that we are going to put $12 million into next year's budget to balance it, it's not out of line with what the board has done before. It's not ideal in my mind, but it is a way to create stability this year and the least amount of change. What risks does this budget or COVID have for us? Well, enrollment is always a risk, but particularly with COVID, what does face-to-face school look like? What does distance learning look like? And what does summer school look like? There could be some changes on our horizon. And even if we do return to regular face-to-face classrooms, are there going to be families and students that choose distance learning going forward? So does it change our long-term context? In terms of the international student program, Jeff has done a great job in terms of predicting what next year looks like. But that is still a risk. Will that international program bounce back in 1 year, in 2 years? We've largely maintained the international student program as best we could. It still historically has always contributed about 30% of its profit to the district, and it continues to do that in this budget. I believe there's about a $1.4 million cut to services and supplies in international, and again, over a $3 million reduction in those 33 FTE teachers. But it still poses a risk because it's a bit of an unknown. Our rentals and investment income are a risk because they may decrease if we are not allowed to gather, or if childcare tenants don't open or remain closed, we will see a further loss in revenue. So those are just things to keep in mind as we move through this. And on the expense side, we'll go to the next slide. Custodial staffing and supplies. If we're going to start to have a few more people in the building, or if we're going to maintain the cleaning that we do now, do we need to increase our staffing and custodial and increase our supply budget? Technology and devices and access to internet support. If we have long-term distance learning, are we going to have greater loss with our technological devices, and do we need to attend to providing or purchasing more devices in order to replace them. Replacement staffing is a little bit hard to predict right now. We don't necessarily know what 2021 looks like, and what do those replacement custodians or replacement EAs or TTOCs look like for 2021. It's a bit up in the air right now. In our budget, it's status quo, and so we think that's the safest way to go, the most conservative. But there may be some savings there if COVID carries into 2021. Utilities could be altered with capacity. So if there are less people in the building, is it hotter or colder? If we have less people in the building, do the lights stay off longer, etc. Insurance may go up given any kind of loss, or if buildings are partially occupied, are they more open to theft or damage? And supply chain, supply and demand. So we haven't had any supply chain issues just yet. We've got a little bit of a pressure on computer devices as well as some of the cleaning supplies we'd like. So we're not so worried about supply necessarily, but the demand side would increase prices. And so that could be a risk factor in our budget. So where to from here? Superintendent's recommendations, we continue to monitor risks, enrollment, and the shifting context, or return to normal. I think we're going to have a bit of both next year. We incorporate the equity of opportunity spending plan. We talk about our consultation priorities if surplus is greater than budgeted. So will we have more money to spend by year end? And if so, should we be pointing that money to some of the consultation in terms of student voice, talking tables, and thought exchange? Should we be starting to collate that and putting our mind toward fulfilling some of the consultation in order to make it meaningful? And input from other sources, how to get some feedback on the budget between now and the end of May when it's the board's decision time. And I've got some ideas about that for the board to consider. And our recommendation is status quo, to provide normalcy during COVID and to work toward that sustainable budget for 21-22 as we had hoped to start this year, and that we are always aligning our initiatives and spending to the strategic plan, and learning is at the forefront, our budget's sustainable, and all those student learning's at the forefront, et cetera, all those guiding principles that we normally have. And so what we're thinking is that, and this is not unusual for the district, I don't think, you've had written feedback given to you, or requests or initiatives written to you before. And so I'm proposing that we do hold an operations policy planning committee meeting for budget on May 11th, and that we ask our stakeholders to provide us with any kind of feedback or requests by May 7th for us to consider at that meeting or to be presented at that meeting. So inviting stakeholders to make written submissions, as well as if we do hold the meeting via Zoom, to be granted presentation times in order to speak to the budget, so that you can get feedback and any ideas from your stakeholders about what they'd like to see in the 2021 budget. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Greg. Okay, so next steps. This has been a very high level overview. I think what we want to get a sense of tonight is the board willing to move forward with balancing the budget with surplus, or do you want us to start taking a more in-depth look at the expense side and start making changes to that? So should we be looking at our staffing levels, at our supply allocations to schools, our own departmental budgets, things like that? So we are sort of looking for a little bit of direction in terms of, do you want to balance the budget with surplus as you've normally done? Then we'll carry on with this approach. If you want to change it up, you can discuss that tonight. As we move forward, what we'd like to do is hold a series of information meetings by Zoom. And these are very informal. And the first one, we'd like to talk about staffing so that we can start to understand some of those levels in schools and why they are the way they are. Not that we want to change them necessarily, but just to have an understanding of the staffing in schools. Again, that May 11th Operations Policy and Planning Committee meeting for budget only. And then May 13th, a Zoom information meeting around departments So what does the learning team department look like? What does the infotech for learning department look like, etc. May 20th, we'd like to do an information meeting on services and supplies. I know this is something that a couple of trustees have talked to me about. We really want to make sure that we're explaining where we're spending our services and supplies in order to see if there are any efficiencies there and to be transparent. And then we move toward May 25th with the budget approval and submission to the ministry by June 30th. And the following documents are in support of the figures in the PowerPoint. And so this first page, I won't go into depth on it, but this is the enrollment that we submitted to the ministry for the 3-year projection that we submitted in February 2020. If we carry on, Andy. This is the operating grant for 2021 compared to the 1920. And off to the right, you can see all of the increases to the per pupil amounts and the percentage increases as a result. What's interesting to note here is that we know we've had about 2% increases in our collective agreements. We know that the whole block isn't applied to wages and benefits, but it's interesting to note the ministry's focus. If you run down to Indigenous education, where we see 0% increase or 1.2 or 1.67 to most of the line items in the operating grant, you'll see that the ministry has made for the 2nd or 3rd year in a row a concerted effort to increase the per pupil amount for Aboriginal or Indigenous education. And this is to improve the results for our Indigenous students. And the next page. And so these next 3 pages are a document that you'll see me use. And so it's a model that's worked for me in the past. And so I just want to make sure that we all understand this document because you'll see it come forward for the rest of the month. And so what it does is it moves the budget from 1920 on the left-hand side in column A and moves it over to our preliminary budget in column I and shows the difference between the current preliminary budget for 2021 and the previous year in column J. And so you can start to see all the funding line items. So under column A, we take the amended budget for 1920, and this will be something new for the board and for the community. I think generally you have compared your preliminary budget in any given year to the preliminary budget in the previous year. I'm going to be comparing the budget to the amended budget because it shows a better difference or a better explanation of the changes from year to year. To me, my opinion is that there is not much value in comparing a budget that was done in February 2019 when we're sitting here in April 2020. So the budget in column A is the amended budget plus any adjustments that we've made since the amended budget was put in February. So that's going to be a little bit of a change for everyone. But I think it demonstrates a better difference when we're looking at what changed since 1920. In column B, we take a status quo budget, and that's just a copy and paste from 1920. So if we did nothing different in 2021, what would that budget look like? It would look just like this year. And then in column C, we start to take away the one-time surplus amounts that were in the 1920 budget, and we take them away from the revenue and the expense side. Because they're one-time, we know they don't recur, and so we have to remove them. And in this case, in our amended budget to the ministry, we said we were going to use $9 million in surplus this year. And that's at the bottom of that page. We move across to draft 2 to the structural deficit, and this is where we start to update our revenues. And so this is more detail than was provided in the PowerPoint, but you can start to see where some of the revenue amounts changed. And then this particular model is the structural deficit. And so this is pages, I think, 30 to 33. And so if we want to move straight to page 34, we'll show you the superintendent's recommendations tonight. So if you can just go up a page, maybe, Andy. Yeah. And so superintendent's recommendations are the same as the structural deficit, except under column E, we've started to make some changes to the revenue as well. And so you start to see all of the draft 2 structural deficit changes under column D, all those changes to revenue. And then as we start to balance the budget, we start to apply some surplus to our revenue, and that's under column E. And so what changed between the structural deficit and the superintendent's recommendations? Well, we know we've got to add that surplus for the collective agreement increases of 3.3. We know that the board approved the use of surplus of 2.8 from its 18-19 year end. And we know that we need to count on some surplus by the end of this year in order to balance the budget, and that's 6.1 million. And if we go over to the right in green, that shows us a budget right now of about $211 million. And if we carry on down the page, the next page, Andy. And so we move into the wages and some of the comings and goings from the under column E for the wages. And so teachers, obviously we have a 2% increase, which is going to be quite a large amount, but we also had to reduce by the 3.3 million for the international student program. And so the reason we're proposing some further information meetings on the budget is to fully explain some of the changes that are going through these wages and benefits in terms of the staffing levels. And so again, on the other side, on the green, you can see 156 million or so spent on wages and 36 million spent in benefits for a total wages and benefits of about 192 million as compared to 190 under column A for the previous year. And if we just head down to the last page here, again, in services and supplies, and we know this is not a robust enough way to explain services and supplies to you, but here are some of the comings and goings based on the fabulous finance team going through every single line of services and supplies and adjusting them up or down based on the knowledge that we have. So utilities, things like that. And so under column E, you start to see some of the changes made to services and supplies. And that's an increase of 5.8. And over to the right-hand side under green, again, we see $211 million in expenses. And together with our revenue, that produces a balanced budget. And so that's the approach that we want to take with the operating grant this year. And if we just go to the last page, Andy. We've stated our assumptions in draft 2 and draft 3. So what were the structural deficit assumptions? I've already gone through those. And what are the superintendent's recommendations, which is really staff's recommendation under draft 3, this balanced budget. And I've gone over most of these in the PowerPoint presentation as well. It's that is the end of the operating grant presentation. I have not brought the capital or the special purpose because they're largely status quo, and we'll work toward bringing those to you throughout the month of May in some of those information meetings and at the May 11th meeting and working towards May 25th. Are there any questions?
I am sure there are. Thank you, Kim. That was a lot of information. Is it possible? Yeah, there we go. Good. Then I can see everybody. Winona.
Can I ask 2 questions, Chair? The first one's quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first one is, where can I get access to the budget package?
It'll be posted to the web. Am I still on mute? It'll be posted to the web under the budget page tomorrow. I can send out a link.
Wonderful. Okay, that was my quick question. And then, the second question, of course, we're concerned about job loss, and we've been getting lots of reports of excess to needs teachers at secondary, and we had originally heard a prediction between 28 and 32 teachers, so this number doesn't seem far off. I'm wondering, with the loss of income from ISP, where else you've considered cutting costs besides just teachers' jobs?
Secretary Treasurer?
Right. So in addition to teachers' jobs, there's about 1.4 million cut in international services and supplies. And the rest we've balanced with surplus. So we've left everything else largely status quo and made the adjustment where the revenue was lost.
Chair?
Yep.
I'm just not sure what services and supplies means, I guess. What is that?
Yeah, so services and supplies are anything that aren't wages and benefits. And so in international program, that would mean agents fees, commissions, travel for international students to go on field trips, things like that. So if we have a 48% reduction in the number of international students we have, it goes to say we'll have far less services and supplies, school allocations, things like that, that we would need to spend.
I have other questions, but I'll leave it there, Chair.
There will be opportunities to ask all of those questions. Next, I had Trustee Whitaker.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, Kim. I have a question about the consultations. One, can we get those dates and whatever emailed out to us so I can get them into the calendar? And two, I'm curious how you're going to, you mentioned that you would contact students and they would have the opportunity to send in their input, but how are we going to round up these students at this point? Do you have a plan for that? And then I just have one follow-up after that.
Yeah, so my idea there was I was going to ask the superintendent if we could contact the group of students that she meets with monthly, just to get some general feedback from them.
Excellent. Actually, no, but someone else has already got my other question answered, so thank you.
Okay, next I see Trustee Duncan and Trustee Ferris.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kim, very much for, and all of the staff in the department for all the work that went into that presentation. It was really informative. I'm really happy to see the direction that you're moving in, and I'm excited to see what the next couple of years holds for us. I do have a question around, I believe it was the second or third to last slide in columns A through C. There was a category called miscellaneous, and with a significant figure. I wondered if you could explain what miscellaneous is.
In general, I would say that, and we can build this into one of those information meetings as well. So I'm jotting down your questions. So generally miscellaneous, we don't necessarily budget a lot for that. It could be anything from a grant from a literacy program that came in, or some sort of third-party supplement. Sometimes it's I'm trying to think in my past what they might have been, and maybe Katrina knows what some of those are in terms of School District 61. But they generally tend to be monies that come in, they're for a specific purpose. We add the same amount to the expense side, and it's kind of an in and out. And so they tend to vary from year to year, and we don't really count on them because usually they come with a condition of spending on the other side.
Okay, and I just have one follow-up, Chair, if I may. I wondered, so you spoke about some of your thinking and planning. I really like the connection that we're going to start to make in a very proactive way to our strategic plan. Hopefully we'll have a chance to start our work on that again soon. And I certainly appreciate why we want to maintain status quo as much as possible. But I'm wondering whether or not, in all the thinking that you've done about some of the changes you want to see us make, whether there's any quick wins. So some changes that can help us sort of trim the fat, so to speak, but are not going to be such a shock to the system that it kind of defeats the purpose of trying to maintain status quo as much as possible.
I think I have lots of ideas about where I see inequity in the district. I think lots of them will make some people unhappy, and so it needs a longer approach and a more of a team aspect. And I think in some ways, I'm sort of grateful for COVID in terms of slowing us down a little, because I think it's going to give me and my team and the senior leadership team the ability to really explain how some of these numbers come about in a status quo way, and it will give us a really good foundation of understanding in School District 61 about where we could move if we were to realign our priorities to the strategic plan and to some of our student data. So in some ways, it's going to build a better foundation for us, being a status quo budget, if that's the way we want to go, in terms of better understanding in School District 61 as we shift and move forward to a more sustainable budget.
Thank you. I'm excited to see what's to come.
Trustee Ferris, I had you next on the list.
Oh.
You'll need to unmute yourself.
All right. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talked a little bit about the idea of a refresh cycle for technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why, but I was under the impression that we already had some of that, or so I wonder if you could elaborate just a bit on that.
Yep. So every year, and built into this budget as well, the board transfers $639,000, I think, into local capital for tech refresh. And so I think that's great. When I look at some of the other districts I've worked in, it seems a bit low for the size of district we have. And so initially, although this is status quo, initially we had, Andy and I had discussed, you know, should maybe that be closer to $1 million if I benchmark it in my practice, right? And so how to make room for that. The other thing we started to talk about, and it may be a bit of a better model, is that I think School District 61 makes sort of big, huge, sweeping purchases every few years. So for example, the teacher laptops was one big, every teacher in the district got a laptop. What a tech refresh cycle does is it talks about just making, same as you make that $639,000 into local capital, it doesn't put it into local capital to save it up for that big 5-year purchase. It spends it every year within the operating grant, and puts every school on a 5-year cycle. So in the first year, you might do 10 schools for $1 million or $600,000. The next year you do the next 10 schools, the year after you do the next 10, so that there's a refresh in the district every 4 years. And so what this allows us to do is to keep up with more modern technology rather than having everybody change at the same time. What it also does, in my mind, in this model is allows schools to have a little bit more say in what's being purchased. So for example, if I have 50 teachers on my staff and 45 of them are wearing out those laptops and 5 of them never touch it, maybe the 5-year laptop is going to work for those 5 teachers for another 2 years. What it gives the, you know, what a refresh cycle says to a school is, you know, principal A, you've got $50,000 to spend this year. What do you need? Well, I need a clerical machine. I need 10 laptops. I need some iPads. I need that bank of desktops out of the library, and I need 3 AverVisions. And so it sort of lets the school attend to what it thinks it needs. And then it works through the technology team to source those supplies and to make sure we're getting the best price. So that's sort of the vision for the refresh cycle, is to make it more of an ongoing rolling replacement rather than saving up for one time.
Great, thank you very much.
Trustee Rob Painter and then Trustee Leonard. Rob, you'll need to unmute.
Interesting. I just got used to using the space bar and it doesn't work anymore. So thanks very much, Kim, for the presentation. And of course, the dangerous thing is the more you tell us, the more questions I have. So one of the things I would love to learn more about is some of the things, and this isn't a for now question right now, but your equity analysis. And certainly it's something that this board has recognized we have challenges with and that we have wanted to address over time. and that's something I think you'll get a lot of support for moving forward. Just with the idea in general of the status quo budget, I can certainly understand a desire when we're in the middle of a storm and a lot of uncertainty, the desire to hold on to something that seems familiar. But not that I'm any kind of an expert, but what I have read about change management, the first rule is, take advantage of a crisis, and if you don't have a crisis, create one. And right now, I kind of feel like COVID, in some respects, is giving us a crisis, and it might be an opportunity to make lemonade, because we've got so much going on. People are already focused on so many things going forward that a change in budget approach is just going to be one more thing, and really is probably not going to cause a ton of consternation. Whereas if we do it in future years after the world's settled out, then everyone is going to be fixated on that one thing, and we're going to get a lot of pushback. But okay, so I'll go back to the questions. One question I had that did cause me a bit of concern was the conservative special ed funding approach. And what I heard, and I'm not sure if this is right, but what I heard was the idea of past year, a lot of front end spending at the start of the year, and that maybe we wouldn't be seeing that. And one of the concerns I have, if that is the case, is that it would seem that the start of the year, as much as possible, we want to have that. I would think we would want to have that special ed support in as quickly as possible to ensure that our students were able to successfully transition, get off to a good start, have a good feeling about their school and their year, and move forward in a positive fashion that way. So maybe you could touch on that. And then the last thing is, can you give us any kind of explanation around the equity of opportunity grant? You mentioned it's a new one and that it's got some specific strings. I'm just wondering what that is all about.
Yeah, I think, okay, I'll speak to your first question first. I think in 1819, the district funded inclusion in terms of being very conservative and holding back a large contingency, and then we're scrambling in the fall. And then I think during 1920, the board or the staffing was all put out at the beginning, and still we were scrambling in the fall. And so I can say that we added about $300,000 to $400,000 over the time I arrived, from October to June. And so I think what we wanted to do in terms of being conservative was really to take a look at this preliminary budget, and we'll get into more of this when we look at the staffing information meeting, Rob. Or yeah. And so we're trying to let the pendulum land somewhere in the middle, where we have good planning for the fall, but that we also are able to adapt in the fall when we see students come in. And maybe some of the equity of opportunity grant is going to care for that when we see that second bullet in terms of non-medical supports or non-medical diagnoses. So what we see a lot of challenge with in the school, and some of the shifts we had to make in the fall, were those students coming into kindergarten that needed supports but that didn't have a designation. So I think what we're really trying to do this spring is move forward very carefully, somewhere between 1819 and 1920. And in terms of the equity of opportunity grant, I think the ministry really took a look at those results for those types of students and looked at the gaps in the education system where we weren't meeting the needs of some of those types of students, and sort of put their money where their mouth is. And this board wrote a letter of advocacy around some of those mental health supports and things like that. So I think the ministry listened. I would say that this may be a toe in the water around prevalence. I look at the types of data sources they used for those three categories, and they are definitely MCFD data populated based on our population. prorated on our population, and then using census data for the third one, the lower economic third bullet. So I think it's starting to demonstrate what could come forward if we were to look at supporting students in a different type of way and really being focused on the gaps in the province for certain types of students, and how do we move them forward and level that playing field.
Thank you. Next, I'll move to Trustee Leonard.
Thank you, and thanks for the information, Kim. I know that being on the board for a number of years, we have tried very hard to cut our structural deficit every year. And I know that some of your comments throughout your presentation said we probably hadn't been doing enough, and I agree. It's very difficult to do the types of things that you need to do to adequately eliminate a structural deficit. We've been working on, trying to trim, because we've been very conservative in our estimates, trying to look at it that way. Knowing that around 90% of our budget is salary, how, if we were to vote on the recommended budget that's coming forward now, how is it that we could find out what some of your ideas would be if that's the recommendation, and are we able to explore the other one, even some ideas or some hints about where you think we would be able to go to start looking at our structural deficit?
Sure. I think when we start to peel back the onion in the 3 information meetings, we'll be able to get a clear vision of what the district looks like, and where we may be using historical amounts for allocations, be they staffing or services and supplies, using historical amounts or using a formula rather than looking at the profile of each school. So that's really, we want to get to a place where we have lots of different ways to look at schools. And I think the link budget, the inclusion budget has really done a good job of looking at different categories of funding. And so we'll be able to explain a few of those to you as we go forward. But I think it may become clear where some of the inequities lie, and where there could be more equity, or where we want to shift our focus to our strategic plan. So if we've been doing a status quo budget for some time and balancing it with surplus, have we really taken a look at some of the reasons, some of the places we spend and why?
So as a follow-up, so again, if 90% of our budget is salary, are you looking at salary reductions in some areas ultimately, do you think, down the road?
Possibly.
Okay.
We'll have to take a look at those meetings and see.
And can we not wait till the budget process next year to start on that? Can we start it in the fall, where we have more time for engagement, more time to look at all of that, so it's not all funneled into like a 6-week scramble, and hopefully we wouldn't have COVID to deal with at the same time, but start dealing with it next fall in a long approach?
I think that's a great idea, and that's our hope. I think what we really need to do, we'll call this a building year, 2021, and we'll really seek to understand what's in the district at this point and where we want to go to from here. We may look at our budget and say, no, everything is fine. We know that we underspend here and we overspend there, and we're happy to continue to use surplus. I just feel like in an emergency situation like COVID, it can really catch you out.
Yeah.
So I'd like to move toward that too. And I'd like to take our time so that we have good consultation and we have good buy-in, and we all understand the decisions that are being made by the time a tough decision or a different decision comes along.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions at this time? Trustee Painter.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, basically repeat what Trustee Leonard has said. I'm kind of two minds on this process. In particular, I feel that the situation in front of us is so unprecedented that we really don't know what we're going into. And I appreciate the preliminary steps that you've put in place in terms of putting a budget before us to look at. And I like the idea of slowly working with that. I think that's really important. I really like moving in that direction. I am cautious of moving too quickly, as Professor Leonard, I think, has quite rightly said. So I like laying out a good engagement process to make sure that we are doing the fulsome engagement and gathering that that information on the various pieces that we lay out, what's on staffing or services. I think that's important. I think other questions that I had and one of the things that came up at BCSTA was certainly around the funding model review and how we might be shifting to no longer being based on an FTE student enrollment model, and how that looks in terms of the budget and how the budget for 2020, 2021 could potentially roll out. I am absolutely of no inkling that they're going to drop down a big change when all of this is happening around us, but I'm just wondering what kind of strategic fiscal thinking you've put into the budget in terms of the funding model review and what that might look like in the next year or so, especially with regards to COVID.
Okay, yes. Strategically, I think we have to be nimble. I see us doing a lot of modeling of different scenarios over the coming months and even the coming year in terms of what does the BC economy look like? Is funding going to be the same? If we move to prevalence, the ministry has said, don't assume that you'll get less money. And I think they've shown that here in that 1.1. So I think, if we were talking about a capital project, I think we'd call it shovel ready. And so I think what we need to be doing is forecasting and running several models throughout this time. So when we take a look at those two slides that had the risks on them, for 21-22, another risk we would add is the funding model review and the final rollout of that. But our sands are shifting now, and they may still be shifting in 2021, and I don't know about after that. It's hard to believe things will return to complete normal. So I think the main thing is going to be to keep looking at all those variables and running different models and forecasts based on those.
Thanks, Kim, and no doubt this is difficult, so thanks to you and thanks to staff for putting this together. Really appreciate it.
Okay, any other questions or discussion? I enjoyed the small parade of cats we got to enjoy there. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else indicating. There'll certainly be more opportunities. This is our first real opportunity to dig in. Secretary Treasurer, do you need anything from us specifically, a motion? I mean, I understand you're looking sort of to take our temperature in terms of going forward with this status quo.
You don't need a motion. I guess what I'd be hoping for is just sort of a consensus of the board, a nod of the heads to carry on in this approach in this time.
Trustee Ferris, did you want to say something? Oh, fancy thumbs up, Trustee Whitaker. Okay, I mean, I think we all know that this makes sense as the way forward, and that's certainly what I see. Good. Okay. Thank you so much. I look forward to future discussion. Did you want to have some heads nodding around the plan for when we have those discussions, or?
No, not really. It would be just great to push them out there and say, show up if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think time is of the essence here, and there are a lot of other competing priorities right now too. So I kind of took a look at my calendar, and I intend that they should probably be early evening meetings so that we can gather as many people as possible.
Yeah. Okay, well, and on that note, I do want to extend thanks to you and your team, because I know this is, we've all heard, unprecedented times, and certainly to be putting a budget together under these circumstances is challenging work. So thank you very much.
Really, Katrina and her vendor have just done yeoman's work in terms of prepping all of these figures, and very easy to find, and I'm very glad and feel very supported that they're there. So kudos to them.
I'm so glad to hear that. So then we're going to move to question period. So I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Hi, thank you, Jordan. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've had 6 emails come in. All have a various amount of questions in those emails, but there's a theme around VIC High and environment. So would you prefer I just read those to you first and then we'll answer them?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
So the first question is, will SD 61 still be rolling out their 2020-21 Climate Action and Environmental Plan in June? If so, will it incorporate exploring how to make the VIC High reno climate friendly and how to aim for net zero emission targets in future district building renos? That's the first one. Another one says, will staff please disclose previous research on energy sources for Vic High School renovation and explain how all sources other than natural gas were ruled out? In light of the dire situation our planet is in and the need for clean energy sources, can you please tell us why natural gas is the best option as you see it? Following email, I agree you have done an amazing job of adapting to the COVID crisis. It shows me that you are able to adapt quickly when difficult situations arise. Climate change is one of those difficult situations, and adapting our schools is a way for you to react. How are you going to address this in association with Vic High? And another one tied to climate. What are the district's plans to continue the climate planning and to ensure that we have a green recovery from the pandemic? When will the climate plan be available to the public? How will the district meet the necessary 7% emissions reductions this year as per the United Nations requirement to meet a 45% reduction by 2030, which the district committed to already, ? So those are the first 4.
Okay, so just to be clear, those are 4 sets of questions.
Yes. All around climate change and Vic High renovations and how we can aim for net zero emissions.
Excellent. Perhaps we can start with the climate action plan and where we are on that, and then move to Vic High more specifically. Superintendent Green.
Thank you, Chair. So I can certainly speak to the starting concept of the climate plan and I'll ask Greg to follow up. We began with looking at, from the big picture, all the things the district was currently doing to align the direction of each of those different concepts in moving forward. If we're looking at gardening, where we're planning on going with that. And that was ultimately going to be the conduit of looking at some of the direction, creating the plan on where to from here. We've been severely interrupted by the COVID pandemic and have not been able to put any of those concepts and ideas forward, although I know that Greg Kitchen certainly had created a lot of that future thinking as we got to the stop point ultimately at the end of February. So I'm not sure that knowing what COVID and pandemic response is taking out of our time and trying to adapt and keep up with the next pieces, if we will actually have it completed, but I can let Greg follow up and speak to that.
Yeah, much like Superintendent Green said, we through the course of the spring, we were bringing presentations to the board regarding our climate action around the school district. We had a number of greening projects and some garden projects. We were doing some presentations on energy saving and print reduction. And our plans were to bring some facility and carbon reduction plans to the board, things that we're doing, things that we need to do further or additional work in. And we also had plans to present some of the educational components that we had in our school and in our community to support climate initiatives. So as Superintendent Green said, much of those presentations, of course, now have been put on hold. The presentations that we have brought to the board to date, I will provide the board with a summary of those presentations. And then from there, we'll be able to, when we're able to return to normal and bring some of those presentations that we were unable to back to the board at a later date, then we can include those in that climate action plan. And again, we were asking groups and looking at the work we were doing across the district. What were we doing well? What areas did we need to do more in? And bring that together in a plan that everybody could see the direction that we were heading. So unfortunately, much of those presentations need to be put on hold. The work, of course, has continued to happen, and look forward to another date when we can bring that back to the board.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next piece for this is around Vic High and which energy sources were considered and why we settled on natural gas. I do believe this has been a part of previous presentations, so hopefully we can answer this tonight as well. Secretary Treasurer?
I'm going to, I think Jim Souls is on the meeting, so I wonder if we could call on him. I know he gave a great answer the other night, a couple of months ago. So Jim, are you there?
Jim, are you there? And if you are you muted?
Andy Canty may need to unmute him.
Andy, can you unmute Jim?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful. Welcome.
Excellent. The question was, were other sources than natural gas considered for Vic High? And the answer is no. Well, the answer is briefly, I suppose, but there was no other good choice. The ministry, this was a seismic upgrade project. There was no, we could have spent $1 million or $1.5 million and put in air to hot water source heat pumps, which would have used electricity instead of natural gas. And then it would have cost us, well, we would have saved some money in operating costs, but we would have been short $1.5 million that wasn't funded by the ministry.
Lisa, is there any other piece of that question that we haven't?
There's a follow-up question from another email regarding the cost of geo-exchange. Did you want me to read that one?
Please.
Okay. Has the district explored partnering with the Capital Region Housing Corporation to share the cost of geo-exchange heating for Vic High and the proposed affordable housing development?
Would you like me to answer that as well?
Yes, if you can, that'd be awesome.
The Vic High seismic project, the conceptual design and the project development all started before the Capital Region, before the Caledonia project was even being considered. Start with. Secondly, the geo-exchange heating for Vic High that really doesn't make any sense. I don't know what the question is. It's technically confusing. So the answer is we didn't explore sharing it because there was no advantage. There would be no advantage to either party to share the cost of heating.
Okay.
It's just not that, it's not that simple.
Thanks, Jim. Lisa?
Jim, just to follow up, sorry, could you explain how the other sources other than natural gas were ruled out? Sorry if I missed that. That was just the
follow-up. The only other sources really would be wind or solar or electricity or natural gas or oil. Oil is obviously not a better candidate. Natural gas is the least expensive candidate because natural gas is cheap right now and promises to be for quite a while. Electricity is expensive, and the only way to use electricity would be to put in heat exchangers or heat pumps, which is that $1.5 million figure I mentioned a while ago.
Okay.
Does that help? Wind is not really an alternative, and solar wasn't an alternative in this school because there was no way to put up, it wasn't physically something that could be built easily at that school. And again, it would require a major capital investment that we didn't have the funding for.
Okay, Lisa, are there other questions?
Yeah, there's one last one. Here I go. According to the last memo from BC Ministry of Education, high school students should receive 3 hours a week per course. Unfortunately, this requirement has not been met for all 4 courses, I believe. It's what it's trying to say. My child is enrolled this semester. For this month, the students have received 1 email from teachers, usually 1 assignment per 2 weeks. There's been no lecture sessions, email feedback, or virtual face-to-face meeting. As parents, we are extremely frustrated. Is this the new approach for online education?
Superintendent Green?
So I can speak to the overall response with the pandemic. We did put out an overview for all teachers and staff to balance the amount of time that they were in elementary, middle, and secondary, and obviously in secondary, some amount of time per course to be putting in. We were receiving 2 ends of concerns. One of them where parents and students were feeling overwhelmed with the amount of work that was coming through, and others wondering how they linked in, and of course, figuring out what platform that teachers were going to be utilizing. So we put out that recommendation. We've certainly been helping teachers as they get the platforms up and running, and we've been building on those with teachers and teacher support as we move forward. So I would encourage if a parent or a student is feeling that the course load is not meeting their expectations, that they reach out to the school, to the teacher, and let them know, and or the principal in the school, and have a conversation. We have realized in some of our platforms that whether students had a link to technology or we're linking in on a regular basis, that we've done a wraparound for some of those kids if they've missed out on them. But I would encourage any parents that feel that there's not that connection and the amount of support that they feel they want to be receiving to reach out to the teachers. They've been very open and responsive to all of those concerns and conversation.
Hey, thank you so much.
There are no more questions.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Trustee Rob Painter, I saw you indicating you're good. Okay, then we move on to F on our agenda, which is public disclosure of in-camera items. And I've got one this evening, which is related to a motion passed on, I believe it was March 9th, but just let me, March 9th. Which is that the board approved the appropriation of $846,343 from local capital reserve for the following capital projects: $200,000 for the Victor School abatement, $250,000 for the George J. Portable, $231,343 for the Sundance Bank kindergarten cohort startup, and $165,000 for the Tomy manufacturing construction. So that's the only thing I'm moving out of in camera tonight. And then we move straight to new business. And so I'll turn it over to Trustee Ryan Painter at G1.
Thank you, Chair. The motion that I am bringing is that the board directs staff to analyze options to direct capital funding for making the Vic High seismic project a net zero ready project. And I'll wait to see if I have a seconder before I motivate. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Trustee Painter.
All right, so I had a brief discussion with Secretary Treasurer Morris last week, and there's actually been a few ongoing discussions about this. With regards to the Vic High seismic. This motion was actually intended to come at the beginning of April or around April for ops. And while it certainly isn't an emergent issue with regards to COVID-19, it is more of an urgent issue with regards to where the phase of the Vic High seismic project is and where it's moving. And I felt it necessary to bring to the board tonight to see if we can agree to move this motion forward to provide some direction to staff. I think we've certainly heard from the community, and I'm certainly interested in analyzing what options we can review to direct capital funding for making the Vic High seismic project net zero ready. I think we have an opportunity to make Vic High a project unlike any other. It already is going to be, but in terms of a net zero ready project, I think it has an incredible opportunity. There is a groundswell of support. I think we have lots of options on the table, and I would just like them to be analyzed so that we as a board can have a fulsome idea of what they are. And if those options come to us and there is no discernible path forward, I'm certainly willing to say we've gone down the path we can. But I want to have all the options laid out in front of me before I feel I've shut the door on making Vic High a net zero ready project. So that's why I brought this motion forward. It's really important. I think the community certainly wants to see this, and I think for the high school of Victoria, I think it's an important project to look at. So that's my motivation, and I look forward to seeing what folks have to say before I close. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Painter. Are there any speakers to the motion from our partner groups?
All right.
Winona? I recognize the motion's on the floor, but we're just doing a little backwards here. So please go ahead.
Yeah, it's hard when it's a new motion brought, because it's hard to speak to a motion if I haven't heard what the motion is. But this is certainly a motion that the GVTA would support. I think it reflects the board's calling of a climate emergency. And I know the GVTA has been doing work on establishing a climate action committee and looking at our climate justice committee and looking at ways that we can positively impact the environment at this time. So I think it would behoove the board to look at any possibilities they have of doing that with any building projects going forward. And given the report we've already had, I don't hear that that's really been explored. So I'm in favor of seeing this board move this forward.
Any other speakers to the motion from our partner groups?
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. Okay, so we'll move to trustees, and I'll start with Trustee Leonard and then Trustee Duncan.
So just for clarification, is this announcing that it's new business coming forward to be voted on at the next meeting, or is this to be voted on tonight, first of all?
This has been moved and seconded and is on the floor right now.
Okay, so can we have, so staff has just talked about some of the options to do with the heating. So is it something that they have already explored all of this and we're asking them to revisit it again? Or is there other things that they could bring to us with dollar figures attached? We just don't have money lying around. So if we were going to take money and allocate it to this, it would come from another project. So could we have staff talk about, is there anything that they have not already brought to us that would appear in the analysis of this if they were to do it again?
Superintendent or Secretary Treasurer?
I can speak to that one if you like. I think this question was asked by Trustee Duncan some time ago. And I don't know if it was a trustee inquiry or if it was at a board meeting, but I think we had laid out, as Jim has tonight, the reasons that we didn't use an alternative energy source. We could spend some time on this and bring you some dollar figures. However, I think Trustee Painter is right in terms of the sort of the emergency state of where Vic High is at and its move to design. And I believe Jim Souls already reported out on this some time ago as well, and basically feels, and you know, this is our expert in the field, that given the design phase and the retrofit of the building and the age of the building, it's not a new build. When we look at Cedar Hill or not a heritage building like perhaps Shoreline, there are more options for us to take on. And I think that we're already starting to think that way about those investments in future designs. I would say that it is a bit late for Vic High. I'm not sure, even if we could bring you some dollar figures, the state we're in terms of our budget and our capital budget. I'm not sure there's room to make a $1.5 million investment. And I know that's a hard message to hear at this time, given the climate emergency and where we're at, but we have to recognize that this design and this concept started several years ago. And so I would certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure staff would, is if we could perhaps let Vic High be built the way it's being designed now, and that the board really focus on future projects where design has not yet occurred. That would be my recommendation, but I, you know, take the direction of the board.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, we did have this presentation at OPS a couple of months ago, and we had a fulsome discussion there because that was the topic had come up at that time. And so again, what Mr. Souls said earlier, we heard again at the OPS meeting a couple of months ago. So this keeps going around. And at some point in time, as the Secretary Treasurer just said, we have to say we're moving forward, and we can't keep asking staff to revisit it and keep talking about bringing it up as a motion when we need to move forward with the project. So I appreciate what Secretary Treasurer has just said, and I won't be supporting the motion that Trustee Painter has brought forward because I think we've already had the discussion.
Thank you, Trustee Leonard. Next, we're going to Trustee Duncan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify that we're talking about a net zero energy ready building. And so my understanding of that, if that is what we're talking about tonight in relation to the motion on the floor, we're talking about the goal of being net zero energy ready at some point in the future. Designing or completing a building with sort of a future perspective in mind, which might be to convert the energy or the heating source in the case of Vic High. Am I correct in my understanding of what it is that you're proposing, Trustee Painter, through the chair?
Trustee Painter?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, you're correct. A net zero ready project is looking at a project that is ready to go into net zero phase. That's a phase of climate mitigation where a building structure of some type, whatever it is ready to be made into a net zero project, a project that produces net zero carbon.
Oh, okay, thank you. Through the chair, may I continue? Thank you. Okay, so with that in mind, you know, I guess from my perspective, being mindful of the fact that although I couldn't attend the operations meeting, I believe, I want to say it was in March, where Mr. Souls kindly provided the committee with some background details. I did raise it with the Secretary Treasurer, and I think we're all probably more than likely on the same page in terms of wanting to see our district moving towards considering these sorts of things in the initial designs and sort of factoring all of this into our planning moving forward. And I appreciate that, you know, as Mr. Souls pointed out, the design and the concept for Vic High was certainly predated this new board. But I'm also mindful of the fact that, you know, we have a policy on the environment, which I believe it was from the mid-90s. The board saw fit to pass a policy that really directed us to conduct our environmental practices around purchasing around our built environment in a way that meant looking at, purchasing projects and or purchasing products rather that are manufactured from an environmentally sustainable perspective, or with environmentally sustainable materials that are least harmful to the environment. And that policy goes into some further detail around facilities management and how we will, where feasible, and use environmentally friendly products, equipment, and grounds, and goes into some further detail. So, I was reading that and thinking about the motion and thinking to myself, well, is this an opportunity, although we may not be able to do it right away, is it an opportunity to look at the possible future state at Vic High, whether there is an opportunity here to set up the heating systems in such a way that we can, at a future date, put ourselves in a better position to convert to a more sustainable long-term heating solution. And I'm not an expert in the area of environmental sustainability or in heating, and I know we have experts on the ground who are advising us, but I would certainly support the motion from the perspective of looking at that future state and how we might prepare ourselves in the long term to ensure that Vic High, as well as our other buildings, obviously, but in the case of this motion, Vic High is ready to be converted to the most sustainable heating source that we can convert it to. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Duncan. Next speaker, Trustee Painter, and then Trustee Ferris.
For me, one of the big things that this does, and I do realize that this is not a short-term, Vic High and the planning around it is not a short-term thing, that has been something ongoing for quite some time. And I do believe that staff have given us exactly what we've asked for up until now. With the change, with the decision to declare a climate emergency, with the recognition of what is going on in the world around us right now, and COVID's given us a great example of how much better off we can be if we do improve air quality, which interestingly is now the leading cause of death in the world, ahead of cancer, pandemic, malaria, everything else. So it's something that we need to take into consideration. For me, as long as we are basing our decisions solely on economic outcomes, we're never going to get there. The idea of a triple bottom line where you look at social, environmental, and economic outcomes it's not a new concept. I was a co-op student with government 25 years ago when we were talking about this, and so when it comes to Vic High, I do think it's worth actually seeing the numbers that staff did have available for making this decision. One of the big things is that there's a considerable amount of grant money out there, federal, provincial, and other, to actually support this sort of thing that would not have been available if one was considering or investigating natural gas options. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there, like quite possibly not within the timeline that we're looking at, but I think we need to fundamentally change how we evaluate any capital project going forward, whether it's windows in a new high school, or changing the way that we manage the facilities, or the heating systems in schools. And I really think that we need to identify in clear terms that can be explained to lay people like trustees and the public what the trade-offs are when we look at implementing a Walker system for the heating system at Spectrum, or replacing the windows. We need to understand what the trade-offs are. Are they strictly environmental? Is it to do with the age of the facility or something else? But I think we need to be very clear about those things. And until such time as we actually put it on paper and make conscious decisions about such issues, we're not going to get ahead of the game. So I will support this because I do think it's an important idea. Whether or not that ship has sailed, it's good to understand what the thought process is, what options were considered, and learn how we can explore more fully opportunities that come in the future. Thank you.
Trustee Ferris?
Sure. A couple of things. One is I'd say that the district has done a pretty outstanding job over the last 15 years in reducing greenhouse emissions in the district. And I applaud Jim and his staff, for the work they've done there. And I think that with regard to Vic High, if I were to support a motion like this, I think I'd have to know that the dollars that you linked to the capital project required were there in order to, to support the motion. And the other thing I think is that when the board opted on the basis of community input to go with a rebuild that project that cost twice as much as building from scratch, I think we kind of closed the door on the zero emissions project. I mean, I can't say that for sure because I don't have enough information, but it stands to reason that if you're asking the government to spend twice as much money to save the facade as you would if you built a new building, it does limit, I think it does limit your options. Anyway, thank you. I mean, I applaud the trustee for bringing the motion forward. I certainly like the idea, but in its present state, I don't think I could support the motion. Thank you.
Any other speakers to the motion? Trustee McNally.
Thank you. Well, while like Trustee Ferris, I completely support, the ambition and intent behind this motion. I think this would be a really interesting, well, an even more interesting discussion if boards still had taxation power. I mean, I want everything to be net zero ready or net zero right now, and plenty of environmental initiatives to happen right away. But the economic system we live in has always gone for, the lowest common denominator financially, and that's how we've all wound up where we are today. So I can't support the motion because I think staff have done enough work with trying to cope with COVID and everything that's coming at them that way. And as someone else said more eloquently, I think the horses left the barn on Vic High. But as we go forward, of course, I think I could say there'd be consensus going forward that we really need to focus on what Trustee Painter, Ryan Painter is asking for going forward. I won't be supporting the motion, and not because I don't support net zero, I do, but for I don't think we can do it, and staff has enough work on their plate already.
Are there any other speakers? Trustee Whitaker?
Thank you. And I would echo what Trustee McNally and what Trustee Ferris has been saying. I would really like to support this motion. I would really like to think that we can do something really exciting and amazing at Vic High, but I do believe it is also true that it's very exciting and innovative that we're going to restore the building rather than starting from scratch. And as Trustee Ferris said, that's where the extra money has gone. And I think that the point has also been made that these decisions, where we're months away from breaking ground, really, if we continue on the schedule without any COVID interruptions, that I don't see how we can turn this around. I mean, at best, maybe there could be discussions with the capital region. But again, I think they're probably in the exact same boat, that they've got a project that they've put forward, and asking for changes and increases in that funding on their side is probably a no, just as much as ours. Sorry, the cat is at it. But I do think that going forward, as we look at all of our seismic upgrades, that needs to be where we are putting our focus, and we also need to be supporting the public and understanding that it's at the beginning of these projects, not, you know, all of these decisions have already pretty much been made. We're all learning. It's a new world as far as climate change goes and how we can attack that. So, you know, as much as I would really like to support this, because I would like it to be a net zero school, I think that our net zero is going to come from different areas other than heating, and maybe there's more to be done through the gardens.
Thank you, trustees. I'll turn it over to Trustee Painter to close.
Wait, excuse me, one thing, Nicole Duncan has been booted out of the meeting and would like to be let back in if Andy or somebody can help her with that.
Well, she hasn't been booted.
Oh, well, she's just texting me saying she's not on. Oh, there she is. She's coming in now, just before the vote.
Okay, yeah, no, for sure.
Thanks, sorry.
No, thank you for letting us know. Nicole, are you there?
Hi, thank you very much, Anne. Appreciate it. And thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm here. Technical difficulties.
It happens. Trustee Painter.
Thank you, Chair. I really do appreciate and sincerely all the words from the board members around the table. And I also want to make clear that I appreciate immensely the work done by Jim and the rest of the facilities team. These are not easy conversations to have, especially in a time that we're in, especially when we're in a pandemic. It's certainly not something that I think, it's not a place I thought anyone thought we would be. But here we are, and you know, mitigating, adapting to climate change and changing climate, it sometimes means making tough decisions. And not to say that we haven't done that to date. We've done good work. I think this is another step along that path of showing that we are committed to the motion that we passed not so long ago around a climate emergency, which is quite clearly stated at the 7% mark. So I think we are doing a disservice, not just, in my opinion, we are doing a disservice not just to ourselves, but to our future generations who are going to go to Vic High by not making that a net zero school. It doesn't mean changing what we have now or changing the building facilities now. It means asking staff to go ahead, review what is possible, and scope into the future to see what that facility can be. I fear if we take that off the table now, we're losing an opportunity to really turn Vic High into that net zero ready school by just saying, well, the horses left the barn, we can't do it. We're essentially throwing up our hands. And I'm not trying to be flippant, but that's how I feel. I feel that the climate crisis is something that we're facing. It is important. It deserves our immediate urgent attention. And I feel that this motion helps us at least move to a point where we can look at Vic High and say, here's a project that can be net zero. Let's see about scoping it into the future, see what that looks like, and let's see if we can get that done. And if we can't, we can't, but let's at least see if we can do it instead of just, in my opinion, throwing up our hands and saying, well, too little, too late. I don't think it is too little, too late. I think we can do something now. So let's do that. I really encourage you to vote in favor of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll call the question. I don't have the motion in front of me, Trustee Painter. Did you want to just read it into the record for me?
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to, Chair. The motion is that the board directs staff to analyze options to direct capital funding for making the Vic High seismic project a net zero ready project.
Thank you. All those in favor? All those opposed? And the motion fails. Okay, so are there any notices of motions? Seeing none, then we're ready to adjourn our meeting. Before we do, though, I just want to thank everybody for joining us and letting us into your homes and letting us see your cats. And it's a miracle my children didn't scream and yell. I think they're even asleep. Thank you to all of our staff who are working so incredibly hard every day through this whole process. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to getting to see you all in one room And until that time comes, I look forward to seeing your faces in these little tiny screens. Oh, there's another cat, Winona's cat. Next time I'll bring the puppy.
We'll all get our puppies out.
So I didn't want to distract things, because if I showed my puppy, the whole thing would just go off into the ditch, no doubt. Oh, look at Winona's puppy. Okay, well that's ending on a high note. Thank you for that. And it was a pleasure, Jane, to watch the sunset behind you all night and telling time out your window there. So thanks, everybody. I think Trustee Painter had a motion to adjourn. Trustee Ryan Painter, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. And thank you, Andy, for manning the controls. We appreciate that.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody.